Hi everyone. You guys have probably heard or known already from our previous podcast. Rocky and Kiana have introduced us, but to formally introduce you guys into this episode, I am Rotondwa, and the lovely person sitting next to me is
Anuschke, and we'll be introducing the topic at hand, vernacular spaces and the stories they tell in South African context, and the stories that we can tell as architects and students from the art form.
So we got the most amazing opportunity to just have an open discussion, or rather we'll have a discussion where an architect share his thoughts about vernacular spaces and the stories they tell. I like to call him a hidden gem, a gold mine. He's under MMA studio design. When you hear MMA, you think of Mpeti, but we've got Lemaseya Khama. And he's an architect and an artist that is not in the limelight in comparison to his colleagues, and that is what makes us very excited about the conversations that we're about to share with you all. So just to give a bit of a background on what's happening, we are given a project to record a podcast. And so the topic that we decided to speak on the podcast was vernacular spaces and the stories that these spaces can tell.
Vernacular spaces?
Yes, and the stories they tell.
And the stories they tell?
Yes.
Okay.
What was interesting was that when I emailed MMA architect design studios, I was expecting Mpeti, but then I got you, which was an interesting challenge, mainly because you are off the face of this earth. There is nothing about you anywhere, nothing.
Yeah.
It's a quirk of modernism. My daughters say the same thing about me, that I don't have an imprint.
Nothing.
But it's not just me. There's many my generation that are not electronically.
It's not even electronically. With the work that you've done, I would expect that I'd find research papers or I'd find something with your name, and there's nothing except for a Getty image that I used to base a lot of my research on the work that you've done. And I'm excited to have this conversation. And already with what you've given us already, I realized what a great mind you actually are. And you're a hidden gold mine, which is insane. Because when
they're making me hide.
No, I'm serious. When people think MMA design studios, they think Mpeti.
Yeah.
But they don't think about the team behind it. And you're one of those people.
Okay.
And already with the small conversation we've had, I've realized how much of in-depth you are within the context of this country and architecture. So thank you for giving us the time that you've given us, firstly.
Welcome. Welcome. So how do you want me to give you just a synopsis of myself, a synopsis of my engagement with MMA, and a synopsis of why this could be also interesting to me?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. Yes, I am a trained architect, professional. I studied in Manchester, England.
Really?
Yes, that's where I studied. I finished, call it 86. Yeah, no, 96. 1996. That's when I finished. My encounter with MMA is really, call it 2001.
I was born
Yeah,
in 2001.
2001, 2002. And one of the first projects that we were involved in, that I put my hands on, is the Cradle of Humankind.
Okay.
So I worked on the Cradle of Humankind with them. That's how far back that is. stayed with them, call it for the next 5 to 6 years, where we worked on other projects that for them. So Cradle is one, cameoed on Freedom Park, cameoed on what's the other project? Why am I forgetting it? It's the taxi rank. That's the medicine thing also.
Okay.
Yeah, it's look, come back.
Okay.
So cameoed in there, and then I moved on to some of the other more commercial projects. So I then also worked for something called Fairlands. Fairlands is a F&B and what do you call it? It's an F&B call house. That's on Fairlands. It's by the motorway. You can see it. It was done with a joint venture with a company called MDS Architects, with Furban Architects, and another entity out of Durban, which was called. The name will come also. And then I moved on to work in Santon project with them. So I am commercially trained.
Okay.
What that means literally is that I've had an opportunity to work on a lot more commercial projects. So, and in its vices, whether it's hotels, whether it's offices, whether it's shops, malls, and stuff like that. That's what my base is. But that at the same time, in terms of where my meeting is, and it's a very interesting thing that my beginning projects would have been the medicine place.
Okay.
The one that I'm talking about. I don't know why am I forgetting it. The name will come. But what is interesting about it is a taxi rank. But on the taxi rank, they needed to create space for, call it, small business, hawkers. But what's unique about those hawkers are not just hawkers, they're traditional healers. And it's a market where you're dealing with the traditional stuff. Now, of course, one didn't go into in-depth as much into it because I was coming in when the project was on site.
Okay.
So I was really just helping to make sure that the project gets completed. But the idea of creating space that is intended to accommodate, I want to say, cultural enactment, is intriguing all on its own. But you need to understand that these things, when I say the word culture, it means different things for different people.
Yes.
You immediately go personal.
Yes.
You know. But there's, at the same time, when we also say culture, part of our experiences as Africans is that there's an exclusion that we can do all of these nice things, but the way you are and the way you behave is not allowed to be in this.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to become something other if I go and watch a football match, because a football match is defined, it used to be defined as how, for argument's sake, the British would go and watch football, you know, and then we fashion ourselves around that. So it's interesting that when 2010 happened, the idea that people could blow vuvuzelas in the stadiums that were being designed, the question was, will it work? Some people say it's noisy. What kind of ambience is this? But it was also fascinating when ultimately it happened and people were blowing these things, you know. But those are still sits as current culture, you know. It's not necessarily culture that, for argument's sake, if I then ask you and say, yeah, vendor from where? Who are your line of people? You know, And then the question I'm asking about that is trying to find the place on the earth where you come from and how you there behave. You know, how you there behave. Now, why is that important? In architecture, we all begin with a brief.
Yeah, we know them
Yeah.
a bit too well.
We all
As
begin with
students.
Yeah. Now, a brief is written somewhere, and it's interesting because you'd say it as a student. As a student, you will receive the brief from the teacher. But what you experience most of the time is that you are required to develop the brief, put some meat into it, you know, so that you can then begin to translate it into form, into narrative, into story, into ultimately space. Yeah. But you begin with a brief. Now, in the reality of architecture is that the brief is given by somebody. Your client is going to give you a brief. But a brief is more than just a series of spaces, you know, which I believe you're having to unpack. The teacher might give you something that is akin to a series of spaces, but you breathing life into it, you are trying to define what type of person is going to be occupying these spaces. And if you breathe life into the type of person who's going to occupy those spaces, you are then speaking to how the person behaves. It's how the person's culture, you know, how the person lives, how the person is. So turn it the other way around. What if the client tells you how they live? And what actually does that mean? You know, what does it mean? Does he drink coffee? Yes. How does he make coffee? All right. You can immediately move from there to a coffee house, or maybe he's not drinking coffee. Tea. How does he drink tea? Japanese have a whole story around tea drinking. Interesting enough, the Indians too have their own stories about how tea drinking is. The Japanese is just on record that they have tea houses or tea rooms. And that is actually, when you read into it, is nothing short of a religious experience. Just the act of drinking tea. You understand? All right? But that's how they are. So when somebody gives you a brief, he's giving you how they behave, how they culturally are. And your job is to translate that into what animates the space. All right? What animates the space. Or, in your language, it means changing the space into a place. All right? So, in that discussion, is the importance of brief. But I want to use the idea of brief to launch into the relevance of appreciating not just your cultural expression, your cultural roots. Your cultural roots right now come into it because you are the ones that are imbuing life into the idea of the brief. So it's your culture that's coming in. It's how you drink, it's how you sit, how you stand up, what light does for you, why that color is religious, and why that one is sacrilegious, why certain images are profane and why other images are highly exciting, you know, why certain behaviors can be done in this space, and why in the kitchen we don't sit on counters, you know, or I don't wash my hair in the kitchen sink. Those are cultural enactments. It's you now blowing life into it. The other way around, for the rest of your life when you're practicing, the client comes with you and says, these are the things that I want. Now, unfortunately, and this is just a function of time, that list is just a list. Okay? In your engagement with the client, you are trying to draw from him. You must draw from him how they live, what makes them tick. And it is that begins to inform what your architecture will become. Now, I'm expressing a belief. That's to understand it. I'm expressing a belief. There are some architects that believe differently. And I can raise it to that plane where I will say, so some architects believe architecture is those nice shiny buildings that sit in Sandton, and that's it, you know. That's it, you know, and I make some nice quirky forms and stuff. That is what architecture is. And then there are some architects that will tell you, no, yes, it's me translating that, you know, what the client is giving me, which is a photograph of the building that he wants, and I try and put it into current materials, and therefore that is actually what architecture is. I'm advancing a belief that says architecture has to do with how people live and how people are.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yeah.
And I'm beginning by saying to you, if the brief is relevant, the translation of the brief is you understanding your client. And in some instances, it is you educating your client about themselves, because you are getting into the innuendos. You're trying to find out what is their comforts. I mean, it's basically a question as how much light should be in this room. It's not just about you loving light. It's also understanding that they might have a problem with light. So the question that says, how much light do you want in this room? Maybe it could be that, but there's other ways of asking it. You know, are you a morning person? You know, that's a question. So if he's a morning person, you know that his room is facing east. But what are the impacts of the room facing east? It can be literally about the amount of light that comes in, or this person could have other religious reasons and saying to you, my bed doesn't face east. You know, what do you mean by your bed doesn't face east? Because it means that my head will be east, and if I rise with the sunset, I might now be saying to my ancestors that I want to die. You know, so the point I'm highlighting is how different things about how we are important to be needed out in creating these spaces. Why is it important? I believe that space, animated by the life of the individual who owns that space, creates the place. I believe that. All right. Now, there are many different examples that we can go into. So, use an example. When we worked on the cradle of humankind, the nature of the project is that the overarching need, city of Johannesburg developed something called a Blue IQ project types. You know, it's a commercial endeavor to breathe life and interest into different parts of the Gauteng base. So the Blue IQ project initiated an idea of creating something around the area where the cradle is. You know, so yes, in conjunction with Wits, because Wits as a school was involved in the archaeological digs, which was a live archaeological dig. So the center could not be located within the university grounds. But at the same time, there was a need to create something that was more than just university teaching spaces. They wanted a visitor center. And the idea of the visitor center to look after historical grounds as a type has been everywhere. So Stonehenge has a visitor center. Fontainezabi have a visitor center. A lot of historical places. Interesting here, Mapumbukwe have a visitor center. You know, so the questions in the design of this becomes, what would a visitor center to the cradle of humankind be? That is the task that was being put to us. Howbeit, it also sits in a very commercial thing, i.e. we made that bid together with other engineers and a contractor coming together and making a bid for it. So we were our own clients. You know what I'm trying to say? That's what it means. We were our own clients. It's very hard. It's very, 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 very hard. Because it asks you to ask questions about yourself, about who you are, what you are, how you take, and all the other things. But at the same time, it's not about you, because it's a space that people use. You know, this is it's a commercial project. It's a leisure project. People are going to go there to relax. People are going to go there to learn. And over and above that, people are going to meet Mrs. Pless. And this becomes the discussion. What is this Mrs. Pless? What is it? So there's all manner of learning that comes into it. So the benefit of developing the brief sits there, that says, what exactly is it that we are designing as part of this program? At the same time, trying to figure out how much are we actually really going to be spending to do this, in order to inform the government that this is actually what we want, in order to translate this, you know. So the questions are commercial, but the questions are also, call it spiritual. So, given a very clear one, first, inflection, and inflection here meaning different types of people coming together and there being a clash, not an altercation, but it's a clash of ideas. So a simple basic that says, okay, we speak about commonality, we speak about Mrs. Pless being our oldest known ancestor in terms of humankind. So Mrs. Pless was dug out, exhumed, all right, and therefore was studied by the archaeologists. Now, if we then begin a thought that says, we now need to put back Mrs. Pless in the place where they originate, or where they were found. Not say originate, because that one is a bigger question, but where they were found. So it actually means we're reburying them. So what does rebury mean? You know? What does rebury mean? It's a big question. So for part of our European, those that were Eurocentric amongst us, ask the question, is it a coffin? You know? No, it's not a coffin, because you need to see her. But why would I go and see an ancestor of mine? How would I encounter the person? You know? And those are the questions. How do I meet my ancestors? How do I engage with the idea of artifacts, portions, body parts that relate to somebody that I then say, these are my ancestors? If I come into their midst, how do I approach? Where do I enter? What should be my demeanor? Should I be standing up? Should I be crawling? You know? Let alone what the others. So there are those who were European amongst our midst, who genuinely felt they had a contribution to the conversation. So here's an inflection. How does it translate? Is Miss Pless elevated? You know? That means I'm actually going to be standing up. Oh no, I can't, because in my culture, if I meet my elders, I can't. I need to be kneeling, I'll be crawling, I'll prostrate, I would be lying prostrate. So when somebody says, no, but my culture does not allow. So you have these multiple prongs that begin to try and inform how just the act of encountering this is going to be. You know, it speaks about entry. It speaks about pause. It speaks about threshold. It speaks about platform, elevation, view, aspect, vista, all of those things, and not necessarily just from the idea that this is something that I want to do. You understand? Or there's a good view and therefore I want to do that. But from the point of view of saying, how am I in relation to looking out? How am I, and if I'm now speaking about brief of other, how is this other relative to this idea of looking out? Or how is this other relative to the idea of sitting in a particular way? You know, how do I get this person to sit low because now you are Japanese and you want to, your table and your manners is about things being here. What does it mean? And what does it mean to me to be made to be prostrate, you know, when I'm having an out of culture experience? So that's the things that we were having to grapple with, in addition to ultimately creating a form that speaks to the land, understand, that allows for government to get their money back. You know, so there's commercial interest and all the other things that actually come into, they must come in and play a role.
Yeah.
But it all goes back to this, trying to understand how people are, how people live, and why people live. Now, that's the jump that comes from what the cradle offered. Ultimately, we borrowed from other cultures. We borrowed the idea of a tumulus, which is a burial mound, you know, and we arrived at a compromise that says, what is the burial mound for? And having designed it, we got to a point where we realized that Mrs. Pless, we were not going to be giving Mrs. Pless to bury her, because Mrs. Pless is she's owned by the university, so it remained at the university, you know. But the whole act of coming into this place, being buried, going underground, going to the end of the tunnel, and then emerging out into the open. That is it's a story of trying to reenact these different innuendos about birth, death, life.
It's very
You know.
interesting that you say that, because I don't know, have you been?
Yes.
I've also been, and the way that you're describing it now,
Mm.
I think I was in first year when I went. You're not thinking about that experience when you journey through that space. But now that you mention it, now I'm thinking, actually, that is what I'm supposed to be experiencing. That is the journey that I'm supposed to be going through. And it makes a lot of sense as to how you're kind of, I wouldn't say, you're saying buried. But of course, everybody has a different experience when they go through that.
Yes.
Through that journey.
Yes.
So you understand the feeling of, I experience whatever I'm experienced through this burial zone, but then I emerge as a different person through what I have learned.
Look, the discussion of burying a person without literally killing the person and burying them, it always sits in a situation where you are always left with the opportunity to engage, because that's what happens. You are going to go, I might take you through the experience, but you are going to experience that
In a different
and
way.
in a way that is you.
Yes.
You hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In a way that is you. And then you are going to now tell the story of that process, how be it from your perspective.
Right.
You understand? Now, that, my view, is a profound is a profound realization. Why is that important in terms of architecture now? And before I even move, the question of why is it, how is that relevant in the discussion of defining cultural space, you know, or defining my cultural space?
Right.
You understand?
Right.
Why is it relevant? It asks the question of who is knowledgeable about how I behave, my pain, my touch. This is hot, this is cold. And should not that information be used to define the spaces I own? Yeah, the spaces I own.
Okay.
You understand? So the demonstration is we have a whole body of, okay, let me put it this way. There was a period, and it's a conversation that I've had with Mbeti in different ways, around the idea of creating spaces and buildings that are responsive to the cultures of the previously disadvantaged. There you go.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Because I've actually written that down as something that I wanted to bring up.
Okay. So I had a project that I became involved in. It was a commercial project, it's a government project, in fact. So I had an opportunity to bid or to become involved with the project. This is before I joined MMA. So the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, the campus called Trevena in Pretoria, went through a little bit of controversy. We were the team that won the bid. And then somewhere along the line we started building, and whilst we were building and we were coming out of the ground, we all got fired, you know. So, and that process of being fired, we then, some other people went and finished that project. So when we won the project, we won the project on the basis of translating the idea of what trade and trade in industry is. Essentially, we enacted the idea of the trade, that there were such a things as villages of trade, the same way as you have trading cities, the same way as you have cultural cities, the same way you have cities that are meant for religious, you know. So we reimagined the idea of a city of trade. We constructed what is required to define a city of trade. Because we were in the Northwest, Pretoria sits technically part of the Northwest, you know, that's what it is. And by Northwest here is saying here are people that speak Setswana. We reimagined the idea of what the Setswana trading village would be. And then we tried to reimagine the idea of what different spaces should be that define a city. And so I posited a thought to them that says there is a Setswana idiom or a Setswana belief that says to the effect of you name it and then it will become. You know, so culturally, if you name a child a name that says you evil person, the view is that there's a greater likelihood that the child will actually come out with some really evil ways, you know. Or if I say to this, name this child and say, you are a disgusting poor person, there's a greater likelihood that this name, I'm making a point in this instance and saying the name is as important. The act of finding a name is as important as having the child. It's important even further to say the act of choosing and giving that name, you are now imbuing life into the child moving forward. You know. Now, I'm speaking cultural processes. That's actually what it means. But the idea now that it gets translated into in an animate space, or the idea that space is not animate, you know. So some people will say entrance, and I say, yeah, entrance. We have khoro, we have gates. What actually happens in the act of coming into a city? It would depend on what ceremony is happening. So what ceremonies would likely can happen? Can you imagine if people are sometimes, you know, you have to enact certain things. So I'm an uncle, and they are coming to get your hand in marriage, all right? Those people are going to enter through there to come in. What are the different stages that we are going to ask them to do in the act of paying obeisance to us? Because they are coming to ask for your hand in marriage, you know. What are the different things that are going to happen? So we go through that process of defining what those different things are, all the way up to the point of then meeting you. So there's a hierarchy of spaces that gets created. Then it's not even just a hierarchy of spaces, it's also spaces that also define that who should speak and when they should speak. So I'm now giving you a view that we created a storyline that allowed us to define the different areas within the Trevena campus, all right? All the way up to the focal point, which was defined as a khota, which is depending on how you look at it, some people regard it as a sacred space, others call it as a preeminent democratic space, where all people gather, you know, where all people are allowed to be. And in Setswana, in that space, everyone has a voice. Everyone has a right to express themselves, irrespective of whether what they are saying is ill or not ill, because it is their word, you know. And then the bigger question is, how do these things begin to translate, and possibly how could they begin to imbue the different processes of our client, which is the traded industry. So that's where we were beginning. That's where we're now trying to translate it into physical form, where a campus is developed with the roots, with the street, with different points that are just as important, and all of them tied back into the idea of what a trade city would be. And understanding where, if you say this is the king's place, is that where now the CEO of the DTI or the Minister of Trade and Industry, where is it that where he's sitting? So where should that office be, and what should be in front? Yeah, and where would the other? So there's, I'm giving you the ability of translating a little traditional story that develops a story, and that story can be translated into form, building, place, hierarchy, height, root, parts. These are things that we play with, but the emphasis that I'm going on is saying, where does it begin? It begins with a story. Why is that story important? So, translate it differently. Go in another way. Let me pivot into another place. If somebody can tell me otherwise. So, look at cinema, look at Hollywood. So Hollywood has been going through a series of droughts, you know, in terms of storytelling. You know, they've been releasing some of those horrible stories. You know, so the films are not that exciting. Yeah, I'm trying to say, you know. So there has been a serious drought. So the good films have been few and far between. What is more interesting is how different other parts of the world have been telling better stories. Really, really interesting stories. To the point that Hollywood has moved out to go and grab stories from elsewhere and reimagined it, Hollywoodized it, and then tell the same story.
Right.
The girl and the spider, what do you call it? And they've gone all over the world. If I extend the thought further, it just says that in our different parts of the world, our stories are relevant and have now been seen to be exciting. The business case of Netflix is translating stories from the local. And they are fascinating stories. Stories that don't make sense. Stories that let you see different things.
Yeah.
The reason why Bollywood has been exciting it's not just the fact that the Indians are 1 billion, 2 in number. But somehow they tell interesting innuendo things about themselves. The Chinese are doing it. The Nigerians have done it in Nollywood. Nollywood. In terms of telling interesting stories.
Right.
So the issue of interest from a locale, saying we can tell stories about ourselves, our people here, translated into form, into visual form, but we are in a built environment, translated into built form.
Yeah.
There's already a very strong precedent. It just hasn't not been followed through. I want to say it just hasn't been followed through, but there's an interesting precedent. I want to say that we have discovered that we are very interesting. We have.
Yeah.
We have discovered that we're very interesting. And I'm wanting to do a leap that says, surely our training in understanding, developing brief, and in the ability to need out the things that are important from our clients. In there is the ability to, if it just so happens that my client is an interesting, culturally knowledgeable person, I should be able to need out information from him that allows for these spaces to be responsive to the manner of his life. Even to the point of defining form. You understand?
Do you perhaps think that the training that we go through as architecture students, I don't know how you were taught, but I'm assuming that the way that you were taught, like professional architecture, was very much not in a vernacular setting or
No,
vernacular.
I studied in England. I did. I studied in England. But what happened early on is, early as in my first year, two things happened. One, look, I've spoken English all my life by virtue of being on the sub-Saharan plate. You're taught in English, so it's a function of our colonial past. But I realized that I didn't know English when I got to England.
Okay.
You understand?
Right.
Now, in terms of a language, I can express myself. You understand?
Right.
But I also realized that despite all of the fact that I've spoken English all my life, critical questions that I've had an opportunity to actually even discuss that with my kids. And I say to them, I actually think in Setswana. I might speak English, but I think in Setswana.
Right.
And what do you mean by think in Setswana? And I say, I can think in English, but my default is I think in Setswana. There are times when you are speaking with somebody and the person has said something to you, and you are speaking in English, but you have not heard him in English. You've actually heard the person in your vernacular. And by vernacular here it is what is being said, you understanding the context in which they are saying it, how it lands in your ears, and it interacts with your cultural self. What is that he's saying, how it means to you, and it translates in your head. If you are then knowledgeable, you can also even pick up that I know you've spoken English, but you are not speaking English, you're speaking in Setswana, and it comes out. And it is also not necessarily about broken English and stuff, pure English, but the sense, the context and everything else, it is pure Setswana. So why I raised that early on in my life as a student, the teachers asked a simple question: how do you guys do things where you come from? To realize that I actually never quite thought, up to that point I hadn't thought about how we do things. The argument that we were having was, I did a door, I did an entrance, and as part of the crit, the other students were saying, look, he hasn't even done an entrance lobby. How is the lobby going to function? And then the teacher says, you make the assumption that he knows what a lobby is. Right. Not to say I don't know what the word lobby is, but it's the context in which the lobby exists. Why, in my house, if I do a lobby, why would I do a lobby?
Right.
Yeah.
But appreciate there are other things that I can latch on to as part of my cultural self that has to do with how people approach the entrance and where windows should be. Is there in a manner that they will go in and go straight into the living space? Or do I deflect them so that I give them a space where they can be announced? Mm-hmm. And when they are announced, I now know that they are not friend or no foe. You understand? And I can then allow them in, and I understand what spirits they have. Mm-hmm. Or I can deal with spirits that they are coming with that are untoward. So I'm making a point, the importance of suddenly the idea of entrance isn't just the idea of opening the door and going in and keeping the cold out. For some people, it's a religious experience, So I learned that, and interesting enough, also learned is a story that somebody put about the Japanese tea house. And this person was trying to reenact a conversation that he had with a tea master. And in this particular instance, he was being led to see the tea house, and he was expressing disappointment in how the tea house was. That the tea house was nondescript, traditional, no funny, no shiny material. These are modern people. So what is it about this tea house that is being regarded as the best tea house that had ever adorned Japan at that time? But he went through the process, and what happened is that as you get into the door, as part of their culture, there's a place where there's water in a pot, and you almost now need to bow because of where the pot has been placed, so that you could draw water for ritual. Draw water, and in the process, when he did that, sees an opening on the side, and in that opening, directly next to where his head is, he catches the first glimpse of Mount Fuji, which is something of a religious experience for them. And it is just that sight of that curated view that was the whole intention of this enactment. And the guy that tells the story, who happened to be Japanese, then expresses that he then understood, He then understood. So in this thing is a description of form being bent in a particular way to help you step, to help you kneel, to help you bow down, just so that you can catch this glimpse. Otherwise, you don't see it, and you would have missed Mount Fuji. And having your religious experience, you would have missed it. But architecture has been used to actually do that. That's something that one encountered earlier on in life, But the question that says, how do you do things? How do people, tell us, that's the next bit. The next bit is tell us about your place. So which means, because it's an environment where people have not written about this. So if anybody was talking about traditional houses, you would, you'd be, you hear where I'm going.
Yeah, that's a
You know,
big
so interesting enough, when you initially wrote before the back and forth,
thing. Right.
the first question was, what questions were you going to ask about traditional space?
Right.
You know, so early on in life, we also encountered a situation whereby our colleagues who happened not to share our cultural origins always put us in a very difficult position where they say to you, show us an example of the things that you're talking about.
And you can't do that.
You can't, because there isn't. So even when we were doing the DTI project, that question was never, they never failed asking that question.
Right.
All right, they never failed asking that question, to a point that you can rapidly arrive at the point where you then say, maybe the fact that these things where there's no physical example that exists today where you can send people go and see, the fact that it doesn't exist, it means it's not relevant.
Right.
But it's not true, and I want to argue that I believe we can sufficiently argue for relevance from a point of view in saying that you must receive a brief. You as an architect must receive a brief. You must receive unction from the client who gives you an indication of what spirit this thing should be.
Right.
Now, I can kill it as an architect by imbuing my spirit
Right.
into this thing.
But it's
You
not the
understand?
client's spirit.
It's not the client's spirit.
Right.
And neither, I want to make the argument that there is the possibility that the client, if I build this and it gets built and it's not, the client, if the client is in tune with themselves, should be able to say, no, this is not what I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, Mr. Architect, you are wrong. You've given me something that is not what I said I wanted. Because it's visual, because the process of design requires you that you go back and forth and show the client what are the things that you're doing. If the client is knowledgeable enough, the client should be able to say to you, Mr. Architect, you're going off on a tangent.
Right.
You know, I said to you, my people don't enter the house from the east. You know, the door must face south.
But now you've put it
You
on
know,
my list.
you've placed it there.
Yeah.
How should I be? Now you are now blowing the entire feng shui in the African terms in accordance to this. I'm using it on purpose because feng shui is about how things should be ordered. You know, but it is their particular belief. I have a client who he's Indian, Vashtu. Vashtu demands certain things should be observed in terms of sequencing of space,
Okay.
which space should be with, and the idea of there being a point which is a religious point. You understand? All of those things are necessary to be observed. I'm just giving you in terms of brief. There's other things that are just as important, you know, like, and I will say that, and I'm not drawing you into a belief, but I'm saying if you study history, religious location of religious buildings, they are not placed arbitrarily, you know. And in most instances, if you look at where the church is placed, those churches are placed on ancient grounds, on ancient points, on intersection on powerful lines and powerful ley lines. Those things are super important. Those things have a fixed point, have a direction, have a movement that require that we be in tune and understand And if we are not, require for us to seek help from other who can tell you, child, the direction you're supposed to go is there. And you learn. You understand? I'm making a point that possibly those that believe that the relevance of the cultural relevance in architecture is not necessary. I'm speaking from that point of view, that you're trampling on other things that we might not understand.
Right.
We're trampling on other things we might not understand. So I know I've spoken a lot in length, and I'm trying to draw from back. The question that says, how should a cultural space be? How should a cultural space be? I would turn it this way. How could you define a space that allows for cultural enactment? By the way, now that statement is a statement in compromise.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a statement.
What are we compromising?
We are compromise. We could compromise collective involvement.
Okay.
Collective involvement meaning when you now say a cultural space, I must ask what culture.
Right.
All right. I must be able to need out what is the expectation. Then the reason why you defer to client is that client gives you unction of, these are my requirements. This is how I live. In my ways, is what needs to be accommodated in this space. You understand? So information would come from there. But if it's a multi-faith organization, you must understand these different faiths, these different beliefs, these different ways of being that somehow need to be accommodated in this one space. Do they have a hierarchy that says this one needs to be there, this one needs to be here? Do they? Or maybe they don't. Maybe it's a pantheon of, where all of them are afforded the same level of elevation. Maybe that's what it is. So the question of saying, well, what culture is it that I am having to accommodate, is a clear question that speaks to the fact that we live in an environment where we are multiversed. I myself am multiple in different ways. But we live in an environment where we are accommodating different voices. The fact that we are struggling to have the Motswana or the African, their voice to be heard as part of the urban environment, it speaks to the relevance of why cultural spaces need to be enacted. So there's a measure of truth in finding out which culture am I doing, all right? And then there's another one that can happen. What other cultural things are related to this? Because then you discover commonality. You discover other cultures that have the same kind of thing. I might wash my hands in a particular way. And then I discover that, well, the Muslims require to wash their hands when they go into prayer. And now here's a space that I want to allow the ZCC person to worship in the same manner that my Muslim brothers should be very comfortable in also worshiping. What is it? What are the commonalities? What are the things that allows them to be together? Or are we indeed doomed to be segregated? And I'm now going back to the fact of saying apartheid is not just a happenstance. It speaks to these human things. Should we all be together? Or should we really be separated so that our development is happening all on its own? You understand? I'm just speaking at its baseness. I'm not going into all the other politics. There's other aspects in it, But that question still remains. What is the nature, what culture am I accommodating? What is the tradition? What are the enactments that I'm having to deal with. And this is just understanding, let alone translating into modern, you know, because then those are other questions. What modern? How much modern? You know? So modern could be just in the material used, but no, maybe it's not the material. Why should I use brick and mortar when I can use earth?
Right.
All right? And why would I use earth? So there is a project that we are working in joint venture with Ajay, which is the Thabo Mbeki Library. It has been conceived as we rammed earth. And the idea behind it becomes highly emotive, you know. But there are also gaps, and there are gaps which are personality gaps, you know. We're not leading the project. David Ajay is leading the project. Discussion really is around, I'll use the idea of rammed earth. Is it possible that, is it important that of how the earth is chosen? Not in terms of its material ability, but in terms of its cultural connotation. So let me give you an example of what a cultural connotation could be. A cultural connotation could be, traditionally we would mix earth with blood, you understand, and other products, you know, and therefore that allows for this earth to be able to stand up and we can build with it. And that thing is also imbued with natural repellents, you know, dealing with getting rid of insects and keeping away from other insects from eating the construct and stuff like that. It's as part of that thing, and I'm just doing a short circuit as far as that's concerned. But some other people could take it and make it religious, meaning I have to kill an animal to get the blood. So some people then sit with this idea that every time we build, we have to kill an animal, so that it becomes a religious experience. We want to build, we now need to kill an animal, and in killing the animal so that we can use the blood. But whereas I can rationalize and become very scientific about that the blood being put and mixed with the rest of this, it allows for the earth to the soil to meet and coexist. So that's one direction. Can that idea or a story like that be brought into the idea of the development of the library? It's an idea. There's other cultural innuendos that we can go into. So for example, like Mr. Mbeki has lived throughout a series of different other African places. What would be to collect the soil from those different places and actually bring it and ritualistically place it as part of taking memory from somewhere else and put it here? That is a borrowed thought, by the way. So Freedom Park dwells a lot on that. Where Freedom Park, the thing that they call the Isivivan, dwells on the idea that the spirits of fallen soldiers that can't be taken, their bodies aren't there anymore, but that it's gathered. It's gathered gathered with inanimate products, in stone and rock and tree and plant, and is taken and is brought here, and we allow them to come back. You understand? So in the same manner, I can say to you the idea that Thabo Mbeki has lived in different other African places to gather soil that is representative of the places where he's been is also paying homage to the places how he's been, and also allowing this place to become a truly Pan-African space. That's another example. So I can dwell on. So I'm making, of course, in all of this is the idea of what is the story behind it, what is the truth in it that I'm relating to, and I have a view that says, if you relate to the story, if you can find relevance of the story as part of it, you can also imagine and become part of the reasons why this space has been created. You know, so the materiality becomes important. And in there also is an opportunity for compromise. Compromise meaning what material do I take? How far do I go? And what stories does it tell? And then there is also the issue of motifing. Early on, I would say late 90s, early 2000s, there was a huge movement where people wanted to go and grab all artifacts. So you'd come into a room and you find a spear on the wall. You know, and somebody lets you see my spear. You know, okay. The questions that says, what is the relevance of that thing being on that wall? And what about it says anything about the space? And then there's other more religious issues in saying, oh, what are you letting me know about you or about that thing? Should I be, worried? You know, I come in and I want to sit by the door because that guy has got a spear.
You're telling me something.
And these Zulus, you know, they can be violent on you anytime. You know, it's that kind of thing, you know, and we have these stories about people. So what is it that makes us decide on a particular motif that gets placed, and how far are we willing to translate that motif? Does it have to be physical, that's a spear on the wall, you know? Or what is it that I'm saying? You understand? So the example that I was giving earlier about names and stuff, my humble view is that a kitchen, if I understand what a kitchen is in my cultural sense, it's not a bedroom. I'm not saying you can't sleep in the kitchen, but it's not a bedroom. There are things that I do in the bedroom that I don't do in the kitchen. You know? So therefore, the implements that would adorn my space in my bedroom don't live in the kitchen. Because it might just say to a person, no, I can sleep here. You know? Whereas, no, you're not supposed to live. My culture says, my kitchen is for cooking. You know? Interesting enough, kitchens also get aggregated. You know? Our modern selves now, living in Johannesburg, we have the English kitchen. You know, the one that's nicely tiled and looks pretty and everything else. And then there's the kitchen there, I cook the traditional stuff. And that's really just under the tree out there and just sitting there. And then the question that comes and says, man, we want to come and enjoy your company, being with you there. How do we do that? How can we imagine that space? You know, that allows for you to cook your traditional stuff and then also allow us to be with you. Other than you saying to us, no, traditionally this meat, I have to cook alone because I have to be naked. I don't want people in there. So that's it. In the dark, you only eat it after. You know, or the compromise that says, I now entertain, but I also like eating my traditional meat. So I reimagine the space that allows my meat cooking with the three-legged pot in the middle of the ground with fire and everything else, and then other people that can are able to sit and then drink their gin and tonics without necessarily being affected by this process. And we are all animated in this one space. That's actually an opportunity of creating a different space. So those are the other questions that says that I'm giving you what I would look at in terms of trying to reimagine the cultural space, you know, and the names of these spaces, you know. There's going back to the idea of Hollywood being running out of stories, and also us realizing that we have a whole lot more about us that we ourselves don't know, and there's so much more that is disappearing in part of our cultural selves. Things that we're no longer using, we're no longer exposed to. So those behaviors are disappearing. The issue that says, is there a way in which these things can be made part of our everyday environments? I think just purely from a point of view of trying to seek vibrancy that informs your design, that influences your design ethos. There is so much that is available by either digging into your cultural past or trying to learn somebody else's culture. Just digging into it and discovering different ways, and we encounter it every time. Every time you meet a new client, who then says to you, I want you to design me a thing. Or so if I meet a Chinese person and he wants a house in Johannesburg, and he tells me that he's married and is fully in love with a Zulu maiden, it creates a fascinating junction. I had a similar experience. However, this was an Afrikaner who happened to be a farm boy, as in he grew up on a farm. He spoke flawless Zulu, with a bass, where there's a view about Zulu being spoken with the bass. If you don't speak Zulu with the bass, you're small. But he spoke flawless Zulu. They had a plot in Zimbabwe in Durban. The issue with Zimbabwe is that everything that you build there has to pay homage to Bali. So that this idea of what the Balinese design style is. But at the same time, here's a guy who's Zulu in his core, So in the process of trying to work around this, developed a space. And it was a function of the ground is on a slope. To the east, it's looking out towards the mountains. To the west, it's actually falling down towards the ocean. And that made it the house in its 3 levels, all encountering this thing. So at the base of it, we created an area down there that ultimately turned out into a semicircular space in terms of his design. And he looked at it and immediately said, I don't know what it is, but I think this is where my office is going to be. We developed a brief. We developed in design, we developed in the brief. This is where my office is. I hear you. This space, as we were describing it, he says, this space speaks to me, speaks to what I do. This is where I'm going to be. And his office, by the way, he's a professional coach. That's what he was. So he communes with people, and he saw in this place as a space that allowed him to commune. That's how we were going to develop this. The project didn't go forward because some clash that happened. The wife felt excluded, and then I was fired from the project. Yeah, it's just one of those things that then happens. Yeah. That's a story about connection. That's a story about not just understanding your client, which is now the man, but also being earful about the other stakeholders, and also understanding what is their point, and if they are included, where, and if they are not included, how, And yes, the reasons why I was fired and them ultimately breaking down had nothing to do with me. It's their issues. But I'm stating this from a point of view that our craft is that powerful that sometimes certain things that have not been said come up. Certain behaviors come up because you require truth, and it's important for me to also end there. Truth here is saying, if I'm asking you, to tell me about how you live and what makes you tick, what are the things that are important to you and what is not. If I do all that process, I'm expecting you to tell me truth. If you are going to speak to me about your current fad, I'm not saying it's not true. It could be true within the moment because that's how you are now, but it also could mean that you haven't fully actualized yourself, you haven't fully discovered yourself. You are still in a journey. The truth is you saying, I'm in a journey, I'm trying to discover myself. It allows me as a practitioner to understand how I approach the things that you say, I think I like. I understand what I think I like, meaning I'm trying to discover. So I have a discovery, we go in the discovery process. As opposed to somebody who says, I know exactly what I am. And then you discover this person has no idea. And it comes up. And there are very few of us who are strong enough that when we are found out, we're able to say, yeah, you got me. Fine. How do we do things? I don't know this about myself. And people fight you. And that's how you end up being fired. Because you're trying to find truth. Or if you haven't found truth, you get to discover that you were told a lie. And the space is physical. Every time the person comes in, he gets reminded that it's not working for him. The people start renovating the house immediately after it's finished. It's newly built. Why is it being renovated? Certain things were not discussed. Certain things were not aired. The relevance of space, the relevance of how people act, has not been taken. So my view about cultural spaces is about us. We have to define what those spaces are, let alone quantify, codify, record those things for posterity, for those that exist. We have to do that. But when you encounter somebody who's culturally touched and knows themselves, the idea of being able to translate how they live and how they be into brief, and from brief into form, I believe it's just part of, it has to be part of the things that we design and do. But I'm making an emphasis, it's also about being in tune. If you hear it and recognize what it is, and also recognize the fact that maybe you might not be versed in that line of, you're able to actually advise us that, you know what, we need to bring other people who are going to inform us better about what this type of space requires, and those other people could be other designers, could be an artist who can dream up a space, and I'm making a point, the difference between an artist that just paints and others that dream, Aborigines dream walk in ways that are not so dissimilar from our Sen dream walking and painting frescoes on walls, So, anyway, other questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically, you've already given us an introduction as to who you are and what your belief stance is regarding the topic that we're going to talk about. I want to take you back to 2014.
2014.
Yes.
Okay.
For those who don't know, who would be listening to the podcast, obviously, who don't know what I'm about to dive into, you were a curator for the South African Pavilion in 2014, which is not an easy find.
No.
At all.
Okay.
So how I found that is really miraculous on its own. On its own. For those who don't know what the South African Pavilion is, basically, the South African Pavilion falls part of the Venice Bianlee. I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly.
Biennale, it's fine.
Biennale.
Yeah,
okay.
it's language.
The Venice.
It's Italian. I don't know why they must add that, but yes. Biennale.
And the Venice Bianlee is basically the oldest, the most prestigious art and architecture exhibition in the world.
Yes.
Over 60 countries participate in this exhibition, and they promote international exposure for artists and architects alike.
Yes.
And so, because you are a curator, which is a very big position to hold, you were a team of 2, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
Now, can you please just share a brief description of what that exhibition was? Because it's nothing on what it was, what it encompassed, it's just a title, and that's it. And I think it's really weird.
Okay. 2014 represented 100 years in modernism in architecture. So what the Biennale at the time mandated on all the exhibits, on all the exhibitionists, that they wanted us to express a view on how modernism has been for these 100 years. Okay. That is what the task that was given us in a nutshell. What we then proceeded to do was to tell the South African architectural story as it encounters the modernist movement in architecture.
Okay.
That's what it does.
Okay.
So immediately it spans all manner of different things, you know. And when I'm saying different things, it's learning. Firstly, the learning that said it coincided, this period of 100 years coincided with the rise of Afrikanerness, all right? Not just in terms of ultimately the state, but it ends up in the state, but also the idea of a language being developed, a people being developed, being defined, and the need to translate into form. So the learning that we discover is how the Afrikaners then sent people all over the world to study and understand how other things happen. And they went and did that. One such an example of a person has a name called Moerdijk. I'm not sure I'm calling it properly. You know, his work is famous, or it ought to be famous. So that in itself is something that we had to lead out and speak to what it means and the different touches. Nothing short of creating an expression in architecture in modernist terms, that the highlights of which ends up being, for example, the full track monument, okay, as a piece of very well made architecture. So that's one aspect of a story. Another aspect of a story, which is a pure inflection of that, and that actually comes because it represents something that has not been said. Because this other one has got records and everything else, you're pulling it and you're doing that, and you can show where the architecture is. At the same time, when the Afrikaner were going around the world learning all of these things, the African people in their varying guises, pre-ANC, but the roots of what the ANC was, also traveled the world. They went everywhere. They were studying in the US, they were studying in all of Europe, okay, and learned and did things, okay, in many different discourses. Howbeit, because of the historical inflections and certain enactments in law, you do get to a point where another culture is allowed to thrive and another culture is allowed, it's not given the space to grow. And then we are left with the question of the what if. And the what if is searching, that's saying, if a person that is able to create a statue like Venice statues, understanding that Venice dreamed of being an architect, what are the things that he could have dreamt on in developing architectural spaces? Okay. And I'm making a point that in order to try and dwell on the idea of what the counter story could be that follows the African stroke ANC stroke without ANC the political.
Right.
You understand?
Right.
If you try and follow that, you're actually then having to say what else has been done. You have to look at music, you have to look at Marabi, you have to look at Katanga, you have to look at Iskatamia, you have to look at how Lemaseya Khama ends up, not him alone, but the creation of a distinct version of South African jazz. The sound that is distinctly known as South African music.
Right.
And it's not only music, it's other musics. And now, years on, we have Mapiano doing these things. You know, so there is that possibility. But there is the possibility that's directly aired by art. Okay, because now we could tie art in time to say if Mudaik did this at the Voortrekker Monument, here's another product that was done at that time as a piece of sculpture. You understand? And also encounter definitions whereby people will say, but when is a cultural implement a work of art, and when is it a piece of art as opposed to something that is worth to be looked at as a cultural enactment? You know, it's a spoon, a piece of art. You know, so we know. You know, so the guys at the Bauhaus designed spoons. We look at them as expressions of architecture. You know, so who's to say a very well-made wooden spoon that has survived? And you look at it now, and by the way, you go to the Johannesburg Art Gallery. You find the JAG has these things. These things for a long while they were hidden, as in stored out, because they weren't quite sure how to. Do we do a cultural enactment and say this is an exhibition, or do we just say no, we're going to do an exhibition about spoons and therefore we've got spoons? But these are very well crafted pieces, and the discussion or the question that says, a people that are able to define things like this, surely they have an ability to speak about the spaces that they would like to be held in.
Yeah.
You understand? I'm going back to just a simple idea that if you are to speak to somebody who can give you about how the space should be, you need to look at the person that you are doing for. He has all the information that he requires. You need to be able to listen and hear and develop, and we can then speak. So that was part of what our exhibition was. We drew all those lines, and we got all the way through to that was done. So it wasn't we weren't designing the exhibit. You know, in other words, I wasn't doing an installation. So it's a house. It wasn't that. It was really around the storyline and trying to thread out and create these connections. Right. And also create huge discoveries, at least for myself, these huge discoveries around how, what's possible, you know. And these are not just buildings, they're not just monuments. It's also city planning. You know, Marabastad, you know, those are things that also come into the process. And the discussion about what would a Sophia town have had? in terms of a culturally charged space.
Right.
You know, those are the questions that we were having to lead out, we were having to speak to. And some of the ideas that we had around being able to look forward and also see yourself of the mirror, what's in the mirror. And if you're moving forward, understanding what is behind you that has relevance about the person that you can be. That you can be. How is this relevant to part of our conversation now? If we were to speak about creating a vibrant environment where there is tons and tons of things that can influence our taste buds, it has to be in acknowledging the multiple facets that the collisions that happen in our cultural selves happen.
Right.
You know, to me, that vibrancy speaks about recognizing what you don't know and recognizing how somebody else has another into the problem that's at place, and the ability to harness those two ideas and marry things or dissociate things, because it's not sometimes. Some of the discoveries is about removing things that have been piled in that have no relevance, and then finding the clarity of thought around what has been presented to you. So in there is a potential of discovering ways in which I believe within just that space alone there is so much more of an influence about how things should be. You know, answers about how society should live together, answers about how to deal with thieves, answers how to do with, because we talk about, what do you call it, what's the best alarm system, neighborhood watch, you know, or hierarchies in space, you know, not hierarchy without understanding, it's not hierarchy. Because sometimes part of the languages that we end up using is, I say hierarchy, somebody says, oh, you're doing cultural hegemonies, you want to now do toxic masculinity, and no, there's none of those things. But I'm just making a point. It's a need to understand the other. The other here, to me, I'm saying Clyde.
Right.
It's a need to understand the other, understand what makes them tick, what they know. What is it they appreciate about the things that they do? And if you translate that into form, I swear to you, it's the most beautiful thing when you see the reaction on the other side. Because it's almost like these people are seeing themselves in inanimate products. It's a space that speaks to them.
Right.
Literally, it's a space that speaks to them. You know? Yeah.
Okay, so you speak a lot about making sure that you understand your client, or rather
The other.
the other.
The other.
You worked in collaboration
Yes.
with curating that exhibition. How difficult did you find it trying to mediate between modernism and making sure that the vernacular of the stories that you're trying to tell are being heard? Because at the time, I don't think vernacular was seen as the most elegant form of expression.
It's interesting because we expressed the vernacular in terms of absence.
Okay.
Because we encountered the reality of there not being a comparable monument to the Fultrekker example.
Okay.
So if I looked at the Fultrekker monument and said, let's just understand it as a piece of art, as a piece of building in its scale that is placed in a particular point, all right? And at the point where its space is also allowed to interact with the stella, so the moon in its axis and at its particular zenith is able to actually go through the structure. So somebody thought through it. Somebody thought the language that this thing should be expressed as. Okay? Yes, the language is borrowed in all manner of different places, which explains the issue of people having traveled around the world and gathered these things. But then it also gets crystallized. You can see the different attempts of trying to define what would be the language that expresses Afrikanerness. But in the middle of all of that is also a careful telling of stories that when you looked at it, the discovery was that here are people who are telling a story about themselves, but also encountering the fact that to tell a story about themselves, they also have to tell a story about others that are also represented and reflected within that monument. You understand? So when you then speak about the origins of Africa, for example, the language African.
That is a collaboration as it is.
It's a collaboration as it is. It gets born within the African plate.
Right.
You understand?
That's a creation of Africa on its own.
So the answer to you was this: the encounter of the fact that there is no commensurate product in architecture terms.
Okay.
We encountered it fully and had to pivot and say, but what else was there? Okay, and that what else was there became community. You know, so places, so Marabastad, Sophia Town, District 6, these are places. So writings, stories, writers who wrote extracts, and extracts of what they said that has a lot more to say about the people that were there, becomes very important to actually lead up. The artwork and that for the longest time was lost everywhere else and sitting in private hands, that spoke to that, you know, and also arrive at other things that are more political criticism of ourselves as an architectural selves. Yes, we stopped at 2014 because that is what we were required to do. But we had to ask ourselves a simple question that says, at that time, what is it that our newfound democratic expression had been developed back into physical form? What new stories were we telling about ourselves? What monuments were we setting up to further describe? So it's one thing to say the Foot Tracker monument doesn't include me. It's another thing altogether to say, you see, this one includes me if it gets created. You understand? But you see, building has been happening since in 1984. Building was still happening. You know, so independence happened and building happened. Building continued. What is it about us, about this newfound democracy? What are the buildings that embody the expression of this new democracy? There are none. Okay. That's the discussion that we arrived at. Is that it's almost like we become absent in it. Now, this is without even going into the other question that says, you are a cultural person.
Right.
If you were to imagine a space that absorbs your essence and exudes your beliefs, what would it be? Just as an academic discourse, without necessarily going into the fights on who gets the commission to do it or not, which unfortunately I think most of the instances happen.
Yeah.
So I've just described. I had an opportunity to work on the DTI. I can imagine what it could have been.
Right.
Because of what its roots are. What the DTI guys said, and it just so happened to be an American that was leading the process. So he made a point that challenged us, that says, the idea of Africanness being part of this space is accepted. But we want a situation where this thing will be seen physical. In other words, it shouldn't be a bird flying in the sky and looking down and seeing the map of Africa and says, "Ah, yeah, they have achieved Africanness." Okay, you understand? It shouldn't be that.
No.
It should be something that when the people that are using this, if they encounter it and they would not necessarily, because recognizing is a difficult thing, because there's an assumption of purity. There's an assumption of a polar identity, not necessarily multipolar, which unfortunately South Africa, when you look at it in its whole, I would even argue the sub-Saharan environment, because of our historical being, we are multipolar. The truth of it is that the aspects of ourselves as African have been excluded for engage in the modern world. You know, but every time we go home to our ancestral villages or to go to our home villages, there we get a chance to take off the modern world and become comfortable. We return home just to go and re-energize. And what does re-energize mean? It means, you know, I'm no longer pretending to be something other. You know, so that issue was asked, and I remember it being asked by one of the reporters, and that was the answers that we gave them. We said, it is written in absence. You can see the story develop, one side, and you can see the story gain in terms of its form, in physical development, and then you can see the other one being stunted. So you got these two stories that are like that, and then getting to the end where you now have to explain the duality of what it is to be a South African, because and these are the facts. The facts are we are significantly touched by our historical being. Yeah, what we have been. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope I didn't rumble out.
No.
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, there's one article about you, and it's not even written in English. It's in a different language, but it's translated. So I'm just going to read the thing, and then you continue with the question.
Okay.
It's from Andrea Zemboni, and she wrote, or he wrote that.
He.
It's a he. You know. Okay.
He worked for Domus Architecture.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. The art of the pavilion is a space where static images of the South African city today are layered with the faces of young people from the first post-apartheid generation who describe their personal perception of this ambiguous and complex stratification of the cities in which they live.
What encouraged you to use the perceptions of the post-apartheid generation in the exhibition?
Two reasons. One, an aspect of what we've just said that says, if we are to save the architectural discourse, we need to listen a lot more to people other than just ourselves. That voice, the things that we are doing are more than just ourselves. So I'm not going to do a fancy squiggle and then it translates into a building and that's it. That's the best architecture. So people are going to interact with this. And I'm saying, if we are saying there is a death in terms of architectural expression in the country, part of it is because we are not listening to people.
Okay.
That's it. Part of it is that we're not listening to people.
Okay.
So when you listen to the young, vibrant minds, you can see energy. There's so much energy. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of self-expression. It's a self-expression that I wish could be underpinned by, call it a cultural understanding. You know, people knowing things about how their pasts are. And they can place it in a context. And that context is not necessarily looked at in shame or looked at with disdain. You know, it's just, this is how these people lived. They have relevance as part of my makeup as a person. And this is how I am now translating it moving forward. You know, so young musicians can listen to both Hugh Masekela and Miles Davis all in one go, and then create a new form of music. They are not necessarily saying, Hugh Masekela didn't know how to blow his trumpet. You can't say that.
You can't.
Because he did. He's acknowledged across the board. You understand? And Miles Davis is Miles Davis. It's international. The other things. But Miles Davis endeavored to create a new music.
Right.
He endeavored to create a new music. I don't think Hugh thought about it, but Hugh was part of a new music that is part of South Africa.
A new era.
It's a new era. It's a new era. And my discussion then that says, in the idea of creating an identity, a South African identity in architecture, all right, the musicians have created a space, all right. Young people are engaging with it left, right, and center, all right, and they are able to translate for themselves these different things that are before them. Artists, there's a problem with them because our commercial selves as part of South African commercial world is dominating what architecture, what art should look like. But at the same time, what is also true now is that the best artists, or the artists that are being recognized and being renowned worldwide, come from self-taught schools. They're not coming out of. They're not coming from
The strict
from the
teaching.
they're not coming from the academia environment. Something's wrong. I'm making a point that something's wrong. Something's wrong. And in truth, the youth become the first to actually say, no, the space is not working for us. All right? And then the youth begin to colonize certain spaces. So Maboneng didn't begin in the mind of a developer.
It became Maboneng.
It became.
Yeah.
They colonized the space, they took up, and then it became hip to be, and then somebody put money into it, and then now it's dying because money is there, So I would argue that juxtaposition, for us, the idea of ending up with thinking about what's possible. We took faces of young people, we did videos of them, and as an expression of what's possible, but thinking about it in terms of give it word, give it breath, with a view that can it engage, can it result in a discourse? Can we get to a point at the very least where we can talk about my cultural self versus yours, versus what is relevant in my world versus what's exciting you now. So the discussion that we advanced was that there's no forum for that. There's no places where we are discussing outside, maybe amongst youth differently, but there's no place. I don't know of any podcasts where we shred the idea of being a Sangwa, but we do know it happens.
Rather, it's
they're young people
it's
that happen.
ridiculed more than actually appreciated.
No. But I want to make an argument that young people, it's not like all of a sudden there are no more young people that are going into it. There are young people who leave their professional selves and say, I have a calling, I'm going to be there. And he goes. All right. So I'm not saying what is it. I'm just saying it sits within a space. There's a construct. There's a space that can be defined about it. What is it? what is that space that makes a better sangoma than that one?
Okay.
You know, what is it? The same way I can speak about the clothes that they're using. You know, I mean, years later we talk about matros.
Yes,
yeah.
Mathosa.
To excuse the mother tongue intonation. But he recognizes pattern, but he takes it beyond pattern. He begins to discover fabric. He begins not just to discover fabric, but he makes fabric. He's doing something new than just pattern. You understand? That is a basis for a discourse. Not only just a discourse, but speaking as an architect, that's also a base for actually thinking, fabric, pattern, fabric, what's possible? You know, what is it that I'm knitting together? So, sorry for, it might feel,
okay.
I just
No,
need
it's okay, it's completely fine.
Then, were there any perceptions of description related to wanting to explore the vernacular side of living in a post-apartheid area?
Come again?
Were there any perceptions of description related to wanting to explore the vernacular side of living in a post-apartheid era?
Yeah, you know, okay, so we get into post-apartheid. But post-apartheid for us as black people, in terms of an expression of progress, arriving, you know, becoming relevant as far as society is concerned, what has been most negative is that it has taken an expression of other. You know, in other words, I must speak English in order to sound relevant amongst my peers. I get into a boardroom, I can't speak Setswana. Even if the client speaks Setswana, so I have to speak English. So it's not just the speaking of English, it's actually how I dress, it's how I eat. And yes, also what I regard as an expression in build form. The expression in build form is primarily very, 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 very Eurocentric. It has always been Eurocentric. I have just described and said the influences of us exploring a vernacular, meaning something that belongs here. There is tons and tons of examples. Howbeit, we have waited for the green movement, and then there's other movements like, what do you call those things? They'll come back. You know, the one that deals with plants, when they put plants in the biophilic movements, biophilic architecture. We've waited for those things to come and say, oh, by the way, we can reimagine these spaces.
Like this.
Yeah, it's like this. But what still lacks is that space that allows for cultural expression. Cultural expression in its plainest definition. How does this person live? And what about him makes it relevant to be in this space? And defined in this space. So, howbeit, there are interesting things. I remember back in the Biennale things, we had other arguments amongst ourselves, amongst friends and colleagues. And so somebody pointed out and says, nah, man. So the background of it is the taking of the forum and the development in the townships that were built for us, but having those spaces and places and rooms being reimagined in accordance to how we live, how they live. But that's the background. but we were speaking about something called a street party. Now, a street party is a fascinating thing because they take up the street. People serve from this house to that house. It's interesting that even a wedding becomes another version of a street party because one compound is too small to accommodate everyone. So it spills out onto the street. The street becomes the stage. The street becomes the stage. It's a reimagining of space as is. And that's being used as is. Now, the lack is that we have not been imaginative to deal with the vibrancy and the ability to do this, to turn it into build form. You understand? So we've developed other things, but this kind of way people have done, if I want a street bash, it's still a street bash. You have to go all the way back there. And then you'll enjoy it exactly how it was if you remember it. But we've not necessarily enacted it, except now more recently, the different clubs that are coming up in Soweto, you know, that are being generated and developed. So the idea of not necessarily doing the cultural, you know, Vilagasi street kind of thing, but people making a decision, all right, there's this cool club that I'm going to, and these now are developing names, but the nature of them, they are underpinned by what people are trying to define as a cultural expression. Is the architecture, has it caught up with it? I still believe we as architects, we are yet to explore what's possible. So that remains.
Okay. Do you think the South African architecture and art scene has grown in the manner in which they talk and represent vernacular spaces, especially hearing and seeing work of those who are born free?
You're raising born free children. You probably do work with born free people as well.
Yes,
yeah.
yes, and they are very strange.
You're talking to a couple of born frees.
Look, if ever there's something that comes from the cultural past of South Africa that remains now, is this distinct segregation of peoples. It remains. And this might not necessarily be a segregation in color or in caste or in creed. But it's almost like we quickly arrive at the point that says, no, you are other than me. And by other here is using the difference as a basis to put you that side, and I'm going to be here. Right. You know, so that has not changed. So born frees get put in that category. We can't hear you. What are you saying? You know, you don't even know what struggle it is, but you want to have your own struggle. You know, there's a view that says most university students want to have their moment of doing. You want to do it, doing. You want to do it. So there's that aspect. All of those conversations actually come into it. And my take is that there is a genuine need for a new expression or a relevant expression as part of our architectural discourse. There has to be. There's room for that. Not just to look nice and sound academic, you know. So if Hollywood can be bought by their lack of storytelling. What do you think is happening to us? Yeah, I mean, we are telling the same stories in our built form. We're not improving. We're not adding anything further into this discourse. Now I'm speaking to the idea of, let's say, architect coming up with something new, which is our ability. We do have an ability to do that. But I want to make a point that I think the discourse itself, we are not sufficiently trying to develop or learn something new. We're not. We're happy receiving. So if I receive the designs coming from Germany, and I will build it exactly as is, and that's it.
I'm done.
It's fine, I'm done.
Yeah.
You know, I built it exactly how the Germans do it. I'm good. You know, and I've been paid. No, it's not even about learning. It's not. I swear to you, because if it was about learning, we would have accepted that the things that we're building as Tuscan houses were nothing close to what the Tuscans in Tuscany were doing.
Okay.
We would have learned that.
Okay.
And then before that, there was something called the English Victorian, and now there was also there's the idea of the French Pavilion. These are. I'm not saying people don't have a right to decide that I went and had a fantastic summer in France's time and I was in a pavilion and I want to live in a French pavilion. I've got the money to do it, and it's part of my self-actualization. Good. Some people can do that. But I believe that we have not. There is no discourse. There is no space, firstly, a discussion amongst ourselves as architects around what's possible. Just the idea of what's possible. Okay? Part of the pain in loving the idea of a vernacular cultural expression, in addition to being told to show us examples when there aren't any, part of the biggest pain in that is that just the space of throwing ideas about, we don't have it. You don't. There's no. You can't advance it. And let me even argue, you as a practitioner, you end up hiding certain things. Hiding certain things. So I had an opportunity once. In fact, that's the reason I moved to Johannesburg after that opportunity. It's a house that was designed by Adrian Mazaro. Adrian Mazaro is AMA architect in Dainfern. It just so happened that the person that he designed that for is a Dutchman who was working for a company called what is it called? It's a pharmaceutical Draeger Pharmaceuticals. Willem de Lifter, that's what his name was. He's still there. He's retired. So Adrian designed this house for him. It's wonderful modern architecture. They insisted on the idea of modern. Everybody else was building Tuscans at the time. They built a white, pristine, modern house. It was designed very well for the vernacular that it was. Through a friend who happened to be an interior designer, Putlako Hasanere. I got introduced, we had a conversation. And then we were talking about what are the things that are important to me. And we were talking about cultural expressions. And the idea of animate space, as opposed to inanimate. The idea of animate space. Long and short of it, he then says to me, I want you to build me one of those things. Just said it out of it and went through a whole process where he says, I don't know what it is. What is it you want? He says, no, I don't know what it is, but I want you to build me it. He calls me, he says, he had bought a plot next door. He says, that thing that you're going to tell me what it is I want to build, I want it here.
What?
So we did. So I then, having looked at everything, looked at the place, then designed a khotla. A khotla is a cultural place. It sits in our Setswana, it sits as a forum where the community can gather. But if it's translated into a homestead, it becomes our family seat. You know, that's actually what it can become. It's our family seat. So I designed a khotla for him. In fact, let me say I set up, I placed a khotla as part of that land. And the exercise was much more really about placement. And I'm expressing part of the learning that I had to go through. Because somewhere, as when we are taught, we deny expressions of what enclosure versus non-closure is. So if it's not roofed with tiles and everything else, we say, it's not a house. You know, a house has to be like this. You know, so if I've constructed like a khotla, we went and got tree trunks that began to circumscribe and form the edge of this. And I had to go through the process of actually explaining to them how you sit versus the curation of the material. Went and got soil, went and got sand, soft sand, and used it as a base so that when you are in there, you're almost forced to take off your feet. And you take off your shoes. And by actually sitting on the soil or standing on the soil, you're connected to the earth. You know, and there's a focal point, there's an axis. That focal point connects to where you see in and areas where you won't be able to see in. It's an open space, i.e. it doesn't have a roof, but yet at the same time, the roof could be the sky. You know, and why not? Yeah. And I remember in my upbringing, us sleeping in places like that, and feeling protected, having the fire also being there, and the idea of what wood is being burnt in the fire. So all of these are things that I'm now speaking and teaching somebody other. You know, he's a Dutchman, i.e. he's from Holland, not a Boere. You know, so the Boere would have understood some of these things a lot more, because the idea of waking up having slept in the open is something that some would know, but you as millennials won't know, because you live in cities and you can't imagine what it is. Okay. I will withdraw, yes. But yes, the idea of creating spaces where certain lost memories can be reenacted. It's something that I had an opportunity to do and to teach. The end results of that, this guy wrote books, 3 or 4 books around khotla and what khotla is, not necessarily the form, but just talking about the process of engagement, you know, and call it not dialogue, but call it constructive dialogue. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so found it difficult trying to research for this topic a bit. Because the first thing I think we also realized together in researching, the first thing when you Google vernacular architecture in South Africa, first thing that pops up is either Cape Dutch architecture or the typical mud house with a Dutch roof. And
in short, there is no modern expression of what vernacular is.
No, especially in the South African context. To a point where I don't want to say it's very upsetting, but it's a disappointment, because we're growing up in a space where we've got things like spitori that isn't an official language,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's
a
a
made-up
way
language.
of expression.
It's a made-up language, yes. It is. I hear you. I hear you. Yeah, I hear you.
And so that alone, like Spitori, it comes with this culture of the Kavela and, you know, a certain way of dressing, walking, talking. And it's not presented or represented in any way or form. I can't walk outside and be like, yeah, Spitori. Unless you hear someone say, oh, I'm from Pretoria, then they're like, oh, okay, you know how to speak this way of speaking. In that way, how do you think not just those born in the era of apartheid, but us as well, can come to a place where we learn to represent vernacular architecture?
Sure.
Because that's not existent. It's not existing right now.
It isn't there. There's one word. The things that represent the traditional stuff in the built form that have fewer and fewer and fewer. Okay. Interesting enough, if you go to heritage, the Heritage Society, and try and understand from them around what it is that they can tell you to classify a particular construct as a heritage element or not. Almost all of them, those expressions of heritage do not speak to anything that is vernacular, and I'm using the word colloquially here. Vernacular here meaning something that is other than influenced by European expression. So it's not there. So even the idea of trying to preserve, you almost have to operate outside yourselves. It's very easy for me to preserve an old Dutch building because there's laws of how to do that. But if I was to try and preserve a hut, I wouldn't be able to do that because I can't. There's no basis to do that. There's no expression, so I have to now develop new laws of how to do that.
Or cow dung flooring, polishing.
Yes. Yes. All of that. Yes. But here's where it is. It sits as part of memory of doing things. It's the act of laying down the floor that now has become, call it a hope, you know. So when you listen to the works that carried us, not necessarily what it ends up looking at, all right, but the process of building up,
of becoming.
Yeah, those things becoming, that act of doing it, he taps into the idea of how best do I lay this floor? You know, so this floor is not tiles with concrete because where I'm building, this is too expensive. I can't do this. But there's a need for a floor. So somebody says, yeah, but we use earth. So how best do I lay this earth? So the act of reenacting the making of the floor has actually resulted in there being a discourse, a teaching of how getting people to learn again how to do these floors. It's also not just learning how to do these floors. He had to act in a manner of somehow getting these people to love again to do these floors, okay? Because they could see those floors being done in their own places, as in their own huts. But when you then say, I'm going to do a modern house, those things does not belong here. So the tiles.
You're modern, you don't hear
yeah,
that.
that's it. So the idea of an expression of being advanced, it is totally dissociated from vernacular. That's one of the sad things around this. Now, there's other words that are just as vibrant. So when you listen to the works that Studio Mumbai do, so Studio Mumbai, in their expression, they are actually reenacting traditional ways of building to get certain looks and feels, you know. And that sits as part of their architecture. So they're creating just wonderful pieces of work. I don't understand it. It's just wonderful. It's full of craft. It's full of craft. But the process they're doing it, they're actually reteaching old ways of doing things. Is it possible here? I genuinely believe there is. There has to be. There has to be ways in which we can reenact some of these things.
Am I raking?
Yeah, raking. But it's a thought that's worth doing. You know the idea. Okay. You see, I look at the idea of youth, as in youthfulness. I look at it as with the opportunity to try things out, experiment, work it. I'm speaking about experiment within the field, just trying it. The only difference is that I'm saying there's expressions that might not be readily used within the discourse, that says, what if I used that? So just as an example, I'm just trying to imagine, I'm building a house and I'm trying to imagine the idea that what if in one of the rooms instead of actually just doing the traditional normal plaster that wall out is, and I'll just simply one day go and sacrifice a goat, speak with my people, and then take this blood and actually begin to knead it as part of this wall, and express to them that I'm acknowledging them, and this, the effect of this blood being in here is just me letting you know that I'm just thinking about it. I'm not trying to put religion into it. I'm just thinking about it in terms of saying, if that happened, what would be the possibilities of discourse that can come out from that? So maybe blood is gruesome for some people. Some people would say, hey, you killed an animal. So it's some people would say that, but it isn't just that. The issue is saying we are constantly doing things in the modern world. There are examples of how other things were done. The ability to experiment by just picking just any one of those things that I wonder what that is, and you see what happens. And if it works and creates something new, it's good, But if it doesn't, you've tried something. Understand? I would argue that you furthered the space of learning more. You've taken it a little bit more. And so you guys, part of your vibrancy of different things and throwing all manner of multimedia all in one go, which is strange and wonderful to see, because you guys operate in multiple levels, is how my view about you. Part of that is a question of, if one was to try out something with you, and say, here's something, let's try it, what would it be? What can it look like? What is building in earth now? Because now it's fashionable But what is building there? Yeah, it is. It's hip. If I build it, if I do a rammed earth, I'm advanced. All of a sudden, somebody says, "Oh yeah." But it is.
Yeah.
It is. But what is trying? What is it that we're bringing this new back into our environment? I say this in the sense that the idea, as opposed to hiding things, and this is where I was at the beginning when I told you about the khotla that I did. And if I was to do this wall, my natural inclination right now is to do all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes my expression, and then I can paint over it so that nobody asks me, what's that? You know, but I know what's there, and I'm satisfied in my heart. I've paid obeisance to my forebears, and I'm okay. I'm okay with them, and they are okay with me. You understand? But it means I'm hiding something. I'm hiding something. Right now, we hide cultural expressions in plain sight with the hope that the client, if they encounter it and notice it, they will say, when I saw that thing, it works very well. You understand? When it works very well. If it doesn't work, I've tried it. You know, all it sees is just a stoop. That's all it would see is just a stoop, and you wouldn't think about it. But I know why I wanted to do the stoop. I wanted to break the floor, you know, so that one doesn't walk straight into the room. He has to go all the way around. So there's a reason why I've done that. But you hide why you're doing that. You don't tell the client that you say, a person of your stature, you know, we can't make a room like this, you know, and then we create quirky plans where this room is facing that way, that other one's facing that way, and they link up in some way. And you don't tell him that room, because of you and your people and the kind of things that you believe, it has to be acknowledging that. And at the same time, you're married to somebody from Mecca, you know, so that thing has to face Mecca.
Yeah.
You know, so these things, you can't express it, but you hope some of these things pass. So there's 1,000,001 ideas in one expression, with the hope that one idea will go through, will survive the financial, the quantity surveyor removing. He says, what is this? You know, what is this? It's too expensive, take it off. And it survives.
Yeah.
You know, there's another place where it sits where you say, reimagining activities, you know, and if you reimagine the activity, and then bring in a cultural enactment, and therefore, if the activity gets accepted, it means that part of the cultural expression gets taken in, you know. So let's say this person loves eating dried food. He just loves eating dried meat. And then you come up with a fantastic idea. You say, why must you braai there? You can braai here in the kitchen. The kitchen can be designed so that you can open this thing, and then it becomes, overnight it becomes an open air. And you're cooking in the open, and when you are fed up with cooking in the open, you can close your kitchen. Suddenly, the act of actually saying you're going to eat braai meat cooked in your kitchen and imbued with... Huh? It opens possibilities.
Yeah.
It opens up new possibilities without necessarily having to say to this guy that I'm going to make it that you eat braai meat in your kitchen, because it might disappear, because somebody might say, well, and where does my Millet stove go? Where does my Millet stove go? You know,
And
because
the smoke in the
I've
house.
always wanted my Millet, and they are smoking up the place, you know, put it
My
there.
couches,
Put it there.
my curtains.
Everything. Yeah. So the idea is that there are 1,000,001 ways that we can translate. What I think we miss that excludes our vernacular selves from a modern expression. There's no basis to first just to talk, discuss it, try it, sketch it, develop it, normalize it. Maybe in the conversation we are able to normalize. And in the conversation and normalizing some of these things, we then probably have a chance to actually try it out physically. Because maybe the clients have now been used so much because they've visited a number of friends who have these fantastic kitchens that allow them to eat dry meat. So all of a sudden, I want that kitchen. I know you designed it, so I want it. Yeah. But I digress. Yeah. Okay.
Where do we go on?
Because I don't know, I don't want to be redundant. Because
Yeah,
a lot of the
that's
questions
why I'm
that
asking.
a lot of the questions that we have written down, you've kind of already.
Covered everything. Yeah.
I'm sorry for that.
No.
It's okay.
Yeah.
But I
Okay.
hope you're able to knead them out. Yeah.
No. It's completely fine.
Okay.
I think this is the end
Yeah, I think so.
of our conversation. But I hope we weren't too boring of students.
No.
to come in and ask.
The as a parting shot from myself is that I have just expressed to you how sometimes there can be disappointment around liking something, looking for common minds, and then discovering none. Or sometimes finding people that are no longer going in that way. Interesting enough, and I because of the different times in which I've encountered and parted and then come back and we are in conversation again, it's that if we stand a chance to try and discover something new that will invigorate architecture, I am convinced it sits in culture, that thing, rediscovering cultural things. And here by culture is a hope that the vernacular can actually be drawn in. The vernacular is learned. The vernacular understands that it needs to live in this part of the world. The vernacular understands that things that are here, these is the materials that we have. I might have dreamt that I wanted to build with platinum, but I don't have platinum. The vernacular says, it's that dirty rock, dirty stone there, and that's all I have, And so the vernacular, there's a lot of learning that we can gain from that. Not just learning in terms of what is available in terms of material, but I think there's also so much learning in terms of story making. And by story here is just speaking about how we be, how I live, what I encountered. That can make our life so vibrant. So people design malls and they forget to design the space where the taxi stops.
And there's so many instances like that, and
You
you
know.
find the taxi
How
drivers
is
like
it-
striking.
Yeah.
How is it after all these years, these guys are not part of the environment? And I'm now not necessarily going traditional, I'm just saying, they're not part of the
People
environment.
use them.
Yeah.
They're not part of the environment. Not only are they using them, COVID has just told us that these malls survive because of the indigents that were using this. It wasn't the high society people that shopped everything. And in the time when there were those strikes where people were trying to, the malls that survived were protected by the people. They were protected by the people. They were not protected by the police. They were not even protected
by
the owners themselves. They're protected by the people. So how is it that we are still having the language of exclusion when it comes for us developing? That really is that. So the ideas that come now about non-cultural, what's the word? I always mix it. Yeah, but it's learning. It's a non-cultural culture. In other words, it's not a discourse that I go to school and learn, but it's about people that are engaged in them having a voice that is strong enough to express. This is how we do things. The difference between the ZCC place of worship, church, versus the Anglican Church. And there's no saying why the Anglican Church can't be underneath some trees by a river, and can't learn from that context and be biophilic. There's no saying it can't be. But there is now an expression of learning that seems to be accommodative of saying, let's understand how people here have been doing things, and let's learn from them. And then yes, you come with multiple experiences, and then you can bring your learning into it, and then you develop something new. That is what will serve. That's what will save architecture. Other than that, we're dying if we're following the Europeans.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Thank you for listening in. That's the end of our podcast.
We love you and see you later. Bye.
Bye.